guys.
You may be seated.
Case number 15789. Today's case sees Mr. Joel Ver as its judge. On the morning of the 22nd of July 2011, Mr. Thomas Manfoy was found frozen to death in the large fridge of the restaurant he owned. Mr. Bart Stroper, who owned the restaurant with Mr. Thomas in a 50-50 partnership, is accused of killing Mr. Thomas by locking him inside the fridge till he is dead. The prosecutor for today is Mr. Gannon Fulbright, and the defense's attorney is Mr. Oscar Chandler. The witnesses are the accountant, Mr. Frederick Brandon, and the chef of the restaurant, Mr. Butch Cassidy.
The prosecutor may start his opening statement.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Gannon Fulbright, and I represent the state of Michigan. Sitting on a table in front of his business partner, Mr. Thomas and the defendant were discussing their failing business. Mr. Thomas, a single indebted man, trusted his friend. He ended up being frozen to death in the restaurant refrigerator, which was an act of greed and vengeance. He knew very well from Mr. Frederick, who was the lawyer he hired, that Mr. Thomas was stealing from their business. Mr. Thomas was also single with no recorded relatives. If he were dead, his assets would be immediately transferred to his business partner. Ladies and gentlemen, it couldn't get any clearer. Why would anyone invite their business partner at that late time of the night to discuss their business? No, he wanted to do that, to kill his partner. He had enough motives. If he were dead, his assets would be transferred immediately to his business partner. Ladies and gentlemen, it couldn't get clearer. Why would someone invite their business partner over a dinner at that late time of the night to just discuss business? After knowing that scandal, Mr. Thomas made a mistake, a grave one, but his punishment belonged to a court, not extrajudicial killing. The defendant's motives were clear. He wanted to avenge himself, and he wanted to win the business for himself. Honorable Judge, I implore you to take a closer look at the provided documents and the witness's testimony, and they will sure lead you to decide that the defendant is guilty.
Thank you, Mr. Fulbright. The defense may start examining his witness.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, judge and jury. I am Oscar Schindler, and it's my privilege to represent Mr. Bart on this case before you today. You heard what the prosecutor aims to prove, but the prosecutor did not tell you what the facts. The fact is, when Mr. Bart went into the restaurant that day, it wasn't to kill or harm. It was to meet his partner and friend, and to discuss some future plans to help flourish their partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to tell you the story of these two friends. Mr. Bart and Mr. Thomas have been friends for over 30 years, and their friendship started when they met each other in the orphanage. With no other friends and, of course, with no family, they formed an unbreakable bond and were always together no matter what happened. 3 years ago, they invested all the money they had in a restaurant, hoping that luck would join their side. Unfortunately, life wasn't that romantic as the business wasn't so successful. The losses caused Mr. Thomas's debts to increase more and more, and his excessive consumption of alcohol deteriorated his mental health and brought him nothing but depression. After the meeting between Mr. Bart and Mr. Thomas, the latter felt that he lost everything as the hopes of rescuing the business have completely diminished. So, tragically, Mr. Thomas decided to commit suicide by locking himself inside the fridge of the restaurant. He decided to sleep, but forever. Therefore, as my witness, Mr. Butch Cassidy, will show, my client is nothing but innocent. Mr. Butch knows everything about the relation between Mr. Bart and Mr. Thomas. He will also reveal how the mental health of Mr. Thomas was before he passed away. My Honor, I'm asking you to keep an open mind to all the evidences we will provide today, because he will undoubtedly reveal that my client is far from being guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oscar. Mr. Luke, please call the first witness.
Mr. Frederick Brandon. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir, I do.
Mr. Fulbright, please start examining your witness.
Mr. Fulbright, could you tell us when you were hired by the company?
Mr. Bart hired me on the 5th of January 2011 to investigate and analyze the company's financial records.
Did you have any type of previous contact or acquaintance with Mr. Bart or Mr. Thomas?
No, sir, I have never had any previous contact with either of them.
Can you explain your findings?
The company's revenues were steady and the financial state was solid. It wasn't until September in 2010 that the downfall of the company started. I later found out that Mr. Thomas was responsible for the company's losses after approving of many various deals with imaginary companies that didn't exist. Mr. Thomas must have been embezzling money by doing that.
When you first came, how did Mr. Thomas react?
He was a little bit odd. After that, he was very nice. He kept sending me presents. He once invited me to have dinner with him. After I found out that he was embezzling money, he begged me not to tell his partner, as he would get very mad. He also told me that his partner had anger management issues.
How did Mr. Bart react when you told him about your findings?
His face turned red. He said, and I quote, "This backstabbing bastard, I will revenge."
Did you have any contact with anyone after you told Mr. Bart about the truth?
No, sir, I consider my job to be done.
Thank you, Mr. Brandon. Your Honor, I have no more questions to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Brandon and Mr. Fulbright. You may go back to your seats.
Mr. Butch Cassidy. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yeah, I swear. Bring me a Bible or something. I've always been an honest man. Yeah.
The defense may start examining his witness.
Mr. Butch, how and when did you first meet Mr. Bart and Mr. Thomas?
It started back in 2002, I think, yeah. I was rocking my mobile shack, my hot dog shack. I was working in the streets and they were like my favorite customers, you know what I'm saying? You know, like the people who pay double the check, you know? Yes, so they kept visiting me, and 6 years later they asked me to be a chef in their newly opened restaurant.
You mentioned that they were your favorite customers. Does it mean that they were always together? I mean, tell me everything you know about their relation.
Yeah, man, I'm telling you, they were like two peas in a pod, you know what I'm saying? Hell, if I didn't know better, I would say they were a couple. You get it? Okay, never mind. Yeah, they were close.
3 years ago, they chose you as the main chef of the restaurant. How was the work doing during this period?
Quite good. I had to sell my shack to stay off the streets, but in a couple of months it went better, and it stayed good for like a year and a half. But then shit hit the roof, man. Shit hit the roof. Clients started declining. Food was thrown away. We had to cut off like 1/3 of our staff, man. Mr. Thomas went back to drinking, and that made Mr. Bart tensioned and angry most of the time.
And what about the relation at this time? Did it get worse, or they were able to stay calm?
Well, it certainly didn't get better. I can say that. Mr. Thomas started making debts and taking loans from a lot of people, and with his drinking problem, he stole a bottle of Chardonnay from the stash, which is a very expensive bottle there. So that made Mr. Bart angry, and they started the problem, but it was quickly brushed under the mat.
On the last few days before the accident, did you notice any change on Mr. Thomas?
Poor fella. He was like the loneliest man on earth, man. He'd stay in his place for like days without answering the cell phone, without answering the door. We couldn't get to him, and no one could help him.
Tell me everything you saw on the day of the accident.
The night before was a normal Monday night. It was quiet, and my shift ended 10 o'clock, except that at 10 o'clock there was a meeting scheduled between Mr. Bart and Mr. Thomas, so they had to stay after hours. I was already done cleaning around, so Mr. Thomas called me, Mr. Bart, I'm sorry, called me and asked me for 2 bottles of Pinot Noir, and I got him the bottles and left.
What did you see the next day when you got into the restaurant?
Well, nothing was unusual. Like, I saw the 2 bottles empty on the table, but then when I got in my uniform and went to open the fridge, it was stuck at the beginning. I was curious, I didn't know what's going on, so I kept pushing and pushing, I'm sorry, just, Mr. Thomas was dead on the ground.
And did you see any sign of physical harm to Mr. Thomas?
Oh, thank God, no. He was just sleeping, except that he wasn't going to wake up from it.
Mr. Butch, is there anything you wish to add?
Well, I just want everything to go away, you know. I don't want the only 2 people I know and love in this world to, one of them to die and one of them to go to jail. You can't just send a man to prison for being nice and for losing his friend. Everything is going wrong right now. Everything is wrong.
Thank you for cooperation, Mr. Butch.
Thank you, Mr. Oscar. You may go back to your seat. Mr. Gannon Fulbright, you may start examining Mr. Butch Cassidy.
Mr. Butch, you mentioned that you left in the middle of the meeting. Was there anyone else in the restaurant?
No, not a soul, mister. It was pretty late and my shift was over, so there was no one there.
And you also mentioned that it was Mr. Bart who ordered the wine. Is that true?
Yeah.
And why did you leave?
Well, Mr. Bart is a nice person. He didn't want me to stay late, and he knew my shift was over, so he sent me home.
Mr. Butch, don't you think that Mr. Bart told you to leave so that no one would see his crime?
Can your questions be any more silly? Stick to this important stuff, you stupid shithead.
Are you attacking me, you illiterate peasant?
Peasant? At least it's better than being stupid.
Silence! Order! Mr. Fulbright, please continue your examination.
Mr. Butch, don't you think that you defend Mr. Bart because you like him? And also, so that the restaurant doesn't close and you don't become homeless?
What? No, of course not. No, that's insane. That's insane.
Mr. Butch, please answer this question straightforwardly, without any distractions.
Well, how on earth will I become poor if I... You know where I'm come from? I'm a very rich man, you know? I have a cucumber farm and 2 cows. You know how much a cow is worth right now? You know how much?
Mr. Fulbright, do you have any more questions?
No, thank you, my honor. I've ended my questions.
Mr. Butch and Mr. Fulbright, you may go back to your seats.
So, Mr. Frederick Brandon, a graduate from a low-ranked university with a GPA as low as 2.1, who got fired from his first ever job after a series of misleading financial statements. You also got fired from your second job after they discovered you were not a good enough accountant. So, Mr. Brandon, why, in your opinion, we have to trust your reports that claim that Mr. Thomas stole money from the business, which then led Mr. Bart to murder him?
Objection, Your Honor. The defense is trying to attack my witness's credibility.
Objection sustained. You are allowed not to answer this question.
My honor, the career of the witness, of course, has a major turning effect on this case. So, Mr. Brandon, are you sure 100% that Mr. Thomas was stealing from the business, or this is just another mistake made by you?
Yes, sir, I'm sure. Don't hire any accountant that you believe is an expert. He will just confirm my findings.
I only hired you because you were the cheapest in the market, you corrupt accountant.
Mr. Bart, you are not allowed to speak unless you are asked to.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
My honor, I'm asking you to send these financial reports to an expert accountant to confirm or deny the claims of Mr. Brandon.
Your suggestion will be taken into consideration.
Mr. Brandon, do you have any evidence that you told Mr. Bart that Mr. Thomas was actually stealing from him?
Of course, he has got no evidence because he never told me.
Yesterday I called him to report. He was very angry and promised to revenge. You can check my phone to find out that I called him that day.
So, you have an evidence that you called him, but you actually can't prove anything that was said during this call. Is that correct?
Well, yes, maybe that's right.
Thank you, Mr. Brandon. My honor, I have no more questions to ask. The situation right now is as clear as black and white. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Oscar and Mr. Brandon. You may go back to your seats.
A month ago, Mr. Thomas's body was found in the refrigerator of a restaurant. The man responsible for that is sitting right here in this very courtroom. According to evidence and the witness's testimony, Mr. Bart was the last man to see the victim. He even told the chef to leave so that no one could see his heinous crime. He had more than enough motives to kill Mr. Thomas. Mr. Bart wanted to punish Mr. Thomas for betraying him. He also wanted to take what was left of his money to add to himself. The defense is trying to appeal to pity, saying that Mr. Bart and Mr. Thomas were friends to the extent of being described as brothers. The Honorable Judge, I would like to conclude with a question. Didn't Cain kill Abel, although they were brothers? I have the answer. It was rage. Rage can make man do terrible things against all odds and connections. And this man, he had all rage in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fulbright.
May it please the court. This case is about the prosecutor who did not do his homework. In his investigation of this case, he rushed. And just like any other rushed assignment, his case is filled with flaws. After all, there was no undeniable evidence presented by the prosecution that proved beyond a reasonable doubt that my client, Mr. Bart, murdered his friend. The prosecution relied on the testimony of Mr. Brandon, completely ignoring the fact that he's not a good enough accountant to be trusted. Mr. Bart was a good guy, and he helped his friend and gave him money whenever he needed, so it's completely nonsense to accuse him of killing his friend. Furthermore, the prosecution is trying to use the fact of ordering alcohol as an evidence of the crime. But my honor, this is preposterous. Each and every day, friends and couples drink wine with each other. Does that make the whole community a bunch of potential murderers? Well, if the prosecution claim is right, then the answer to this question is yes. But more importantly, we have evidence that Mr. Thomas suffered from severe depression before he passed away. And we have evidence that Mr. Thomas became an alcohol addict before the accident as well. My honor, it is crystal clear. Mr. Thomas decided to commit suicide to end his miserable life. And suffering from his excessive consumption of alcohol, his mind was out of control and couldn't help him not to end his life. In conclusion, at the end of this case, we ask you to look at this case as an incomplete homework assignment, riddled with too many errors. We ask you respectively to do what the prosecution has not, which is to take a look at this case, and look at the facts, and do the homework, and find my client, Mr. Bart, not guilty on any charges. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Oscar. You may go back to your seat. I'd like to thank all of you for your patience and civilized conduct during the session today. Now, I will briefly recap the evidence that was presented during this session. Mr. Bart is accused of killing his friend and partner, Mr. Thomas. It's alleged that Mr. Thomas manipulated Mr. Bart and stole money from the restaurant. That's why Mr. Bart killed him. In order for Mr. Bart to be proven guilty of these claims, the Crown must establish the essential elements of these offences beyond any reasonable doubt. The evidence that was presented by Mr. Brandon and Mr. Butch closes the door against any doubts that Mr. Bart is to be proven innocent. From the very beginning, when Mr. Bart asked for the meeting to be after hours and intentionally triggering Mr. Thomas to overdose while drinking alcohol, over and above, the expert who reviewed the records emphasized that Mr. Thomas stole from Mr. Bart. That's why the latter was determined to take revenge for himself. Based on the evidence presented in this case, I conclude that Mr. Bart is guilty beyond any reasonable doubt, and he will be sentenced to death.
Truth is, Brandon secretly manipulated the financial records to show that Thomas was stealing from the business. He called Mr. Thomas and blackmailed him. You either pay or you'll end up in jail. However, Thomas was lucky enough and his phone automatically recorded the call. Tables have turned now. Fueled by greed, Thomas blackmailed Brandon. You pay me or I'll report you and use this call as evidence. Brandon had no choice, so he accepted.
During the last meeting, Mr. Bart was filled with anger, and Mr. Thomas just couldn't believe how massive the losses were.
I really don't know, Bart. I really don't know. This is a whole lot of mistake. I don't know where it came from. You don't know? Who knows then?
However, Thomas was confident that some cash is coming.
You want anything else?
No, thank you.
Come on, I'm waiting for you. I will fix all this. Go home now. Let's celebrate!
Mr. Thomas drank a lot that night, and Mr. Brandon didn't miss the chance. He escorted Mr. Thomas, who was completely drunk, to the large fridge and locked him inside. The poor guy was frozen to death, and there was the single evidence against Mr. Brandon.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, judge and jury. هنقول إيه بعديها؟
No, I have not killed him. It was almost like my brother. I can't kill him. Maybe.
كلاكات تاني مرة. Go.
Was there anyone else in the restaurant?
تحته قوي دي كده.
ده كده فاهم اللي هي بتصور تقلب.
I'd like to thank all of you for your patience and civilized conduct during the القطط اللي جايه today. ايه يا عم حسد القطط دي؟ ايه ده؟
Mr. Frederick.
Mr. Butch.
Thank you Mr. Ford. لا المفروض ان هو هنا صح.
النبي.
وضع سهل وبسيط.
I have a cucumber farm and 2 cows. You know how much a cow is worth right now? You know how much?
The crown must establish the essential eh?
You have heard what the prosecutor aims to claim.
Shit aims to prove.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.